So back to Churchill himself, the imperial son. Just read this article. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan said in his first inaugural address, "I did not take the oath I just taken with the intention of presiding over dissolution of the world's strongest economy. If it was curious that an American president should cite an English politician, what made it odder was the line he chose to adopt." In November 1942, Churchill had said that "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Why would the President of the Republic born out of rebellion against that empire want to allude to those words, especially since at that time, spoken them, the American administration and people had been united in their resolve that whatever else they were fighting for, it was not to preserve the British Empire." Born when imperialism was at its zenith, Churchill lived to see the end of empire, notably his own country's, and the part he played in his epic story is fascinating. Lawrence James, the author of several books of British history, says that Churchill and Empire deals with a subject that has been overlooked or discreetly sidelined in Churchillian literature, which is a puzzling claim. Churchill's imperialism was one of the most salient facts about him, much discussed in his lifetime and endlessly dissected since by historians, most recently by Richard Toyle in his excellent Churchill's Empire, The World That Made Him and the World He Made. Is there something new to say? When our present Queen succeeded to the throne in 1952, Churchill recalled that his youth had been passed under another Queen, amid the tranquil glories of the Queen Victorian era, but tranquil was not unlikely word for his own experience. Before he was elected to Parliament in 1900, aged 25, Churchill had fought in or witnessed no fewer than 4 savage imperial conflicts. He was a soldier and a journalist before he became a politician, and although he maintained that the consciousness of dominion over subject races must alone increase the self-respect of every Englishman, he cannily described the realities of imperial war. In 1898, he took part in one of the last cavalry charges at Omdurman in Sudan. Less battle than massacre, he exultantly killed several men fighting for the jihadist leader called the Mahdi, but he also recorded that all dervishes who did not immediately surrender were shot or bayoneted. Deserves. As a colonial officer minister from 1905 to 1908, Churchill visited Kenya and thought that its backward peoples, including the forebearers of the present American president, need to be taught the discipline of hard work. But he was also dismayed by reports in South Africa of the disgusting butchery of the natives. In other words, as we should really have grasped by now, Winston Churchill was all his life a bundle of contradictions, radical or reactionary, but by turns brutal and chivalrous. 3 years later, after World War I, in which his career was nearly ended by the Gallipoli debacle, he became colonial secretary at a critical moment in the story of what is called somewhat oddly the Middle East, as he put it in the 1940. In the engaging memoir, My Early Life, he said that he had been brought up as a Tory and thus pro-Turkish, and it had been a cardinal British principle to preserve the Ottoman Empire lest it should collapse and the Vatican be filled by Russia. When it did collapse as a result of the war, the vacuum was filled instead by the British themselves, in a way quite unforeseen and unintended. Churchill cobbled together one completely artificial state called Iraq, while partitioning the territory to the west into Transjordan and Palestine. Although his own sympathies were with the Zionist settlers, he soon realised what a thankless burden Palestine was, and toyed with the idea of handing it over to the United States, a teasing what if of history, supposing improbably that the Americans had wanted to accept any such responsibility. Interesting that he had, sympathies for the Zionist settlers, and Zionism, is the ones that are controlling Israel. It's nothing to do with the Jewish people, it's to do with Zionism and the globalist agenda and how they want to control the holiest place on the planet and do the most evilest things to the world while being there. In 1929, Churchill insisted that the British had rescued India from ages of barbarism, tyranny and internecine war, and he spent the next several years in futile opposition to the Indian Bill, which granted modest self-government. James is surely wrong to say that Churchill accepted final defeat over the bill with good grace. That was not how most people saw it at the time. And it was India that would be the greatest stain on Churchill's record as it otherwise splendid climax. As Prime Minister from 1940 to 1995, he obstinately thwarted any attempt to move toward a settlement with Gandhi and the Congress nationalists. Worse still was the awful Bengali famine of 1943. Like the Irish famine 100 years before, it was not caused by the long London government, but in both cases official indifference and inaction gravely agitated the horror and destroyed any moral authority the British claimed to rule those suffering peoples. Underlining Churchill's refusal to alleviate the famine was sheer racial contempt. Starvation and of anyhow underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of the sturdy Greeks, he said, and those who worked with him knew well his tirades about the foul race of Hindus. A massive racist. Because of Darwinism, okay? Darwinism is a byproduct and is a byproduct of racial ideology. In the post-war years, he railed, and he was a paedophile anyway. In the post-war years, he railed against the Labour government for granting India its independence, although he then suddenly recognised that the game was up for imperialism. He thought that the French should get out of Indochina, and impulsive as ever, was dismayed by the shameful methods of the British authorities were using to suppress the Mau Mau rising in Kenya. If James' books reveals not much that is familiar to those seriously interested in Churchill, it is a readable and generally reliable despite a few slips. Churchill's friend and colleague Lord Morne, who was assassinated by Zionist extremists in 1944, was not a viscount, and the dinner night in London for Calm Wiseman, the Zionist leader, in June 1937 was at the house of Sir Archibald Sinclair. The Sinclair family is absolutely and massively connected to the Templars. If you don't understand about the Sinclair family, and how they're related to the royals, the Liberal leader, not that of the Labour leader, Clement Attlee, as James says. That evening was memorably reported by Blanche Dugdale's niece of A.J. Balfour. Now the Balfour Agreement as well, if you're not sure about what that is, about the Balfour Agreement and research that's basically how our country and our resources are no longer our own, and that all resources will be pointed towards Zionism and the construction of Israel, and eventually the recognition of what Trump is saying, Israel to be the capital, Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel, which is written in prophecy. And all things in prophecy are coming true because they are making it so, and it has to be, for they are just doing their job in what is the game we live in. Anyway, that evening was memorably reported by Zionists. Former Prime Minister and the signer of the Declaration who was herself an active gentle Zionist. Winston, in his most brilliant style, was very drunk, and here's something James might have made more of. Benjamin Netanyahu keeps a portrait in his office of his hero Churchill, who was certainly a Zionist and supporter of Israel. But Netanyahu should be careful. He is perhaps unaware that Churchill's commitment to Zionism was based on his belief that the Jews were a higher grade race than the Arabs they were supplanting. So it's to do with race again, his actions were to do with racial actions and the helping of the line of Ham, I believe. We are left with two great paradoxes. The man who, at one extraordinary moment, heroically defied the vilest racial tyranny in history was himself not only an intransigent imperialist but a racist by the standards of his own age as well as ours. And although Churchill said he would not preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, he did just that, or at least hastened its demise. At the end of the war, in which he had nobly led it, his country was exhausted and penniless, and in no condition or mood to play the part of great power or imperial ruler any more. A financial client of the United States whose new imperium now took over where the British had left off. All along that was the plan. Others saw this, although he did not like it so to do so. Mr. Churchill ended the stage of the British Empire. Zhu Enlao perceptively observed to Henry Kissinger in 1969, he may not have intended to, but objectively he ended the British Empire. Did Churchill in his heart know that? And there's much to talk about with these things. It goes way, way deeper. There's so much to expose and understand how they've covered up history. So, why do you live in a country that you loathe? Piers Morgan slams Professor calling Winston Churchill racist after a US astronaut was forced to apologise for quoting Britain's wartime MP. Really? And Piers Morgan's one of them. Thing is, they play both sides. They play off each other very well. They play what they need to do. Their perception of what people like, what they want people to see. It's off. So, a professor has claimed that Sir Winston Churchill was a clear racist in a heated debate in which Piers Morgan asked him, why do you live in a country that you loathe? I mean, he's a bigoted idiot. Let's watch it. Oh, of course, they had to have an ad on it. Ridiculous.
If you do you hate everything this country stands for?
I don't hate this country, but I
Well, you said that you believe we're a racist country, built on racism, and remain racist. Why would you? So why would you, a black man who has the means to leave the country, why would you stay here?
Where would I go? Because Britain's impact on the world is devastate most of the world. So where would I go? Exactly.
But you don't believe you could go in the world because we ruined it.
Churchill is a big part of that reason.
Well, yeah,
that's
but
a big part of the reason why.
I've just been in the Caribbean a few months ago.
So there you go. Short clip. And you understand why, like, he's saying he's a racist from that other article, and then there's more. I mean, Piers Morgan ain't got a fucking clue what he's talking about, really. Defending a mass murderer. Look. In Winston Churchill's Hollywood rewards a mass murderer. Written by Shashi Tahoro, or sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, I have no idea how you say your name. Sashi is the author of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. He chairs the Indian Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee. History, Winston Churchill said, will be kind to me, for I intend to write it myself. And they have. He needn't have bothered. He was one of the great mass murderers of the 20th century, yet is the only one, unlike Hitler and Stalin, to have escaped historical odium in the West. He has been crowned with a Nobel Prize for literature, no less, and now an actor portraying him, Gary Oldman, has been awarded an Oscar. As Hollywood confirms, Churchill's reputation as what Harold Evans has called the British Lionheart on the ramparts of civilization rests almost entirely on his stirring heretic and his talent for fine phrase during the World War II. As we discussed already, that some of the speeches didn't even happen, he never wrote anything about it, and one of them was 9 years, later. We shall not flag nor fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. And it continues. The revisionist British historian John Charmley dismissed this as sublime nonsense. Words, in the end, are all that Churchill admirers can point to. His actions on another matter altogether. During World War II, Churchill declared himself in favour of terror bombing. He wrote that he wanted absolutely devastating, exterminating attacks by very heavy bombers. Horrors, such as the firebombing of Dresden, were the result. In the fight for British independence, Churchill, in his capacity as Secretary of State for War and Air, was one of the few British officers in favour of bombing Irish protesters, suggesting in 1920 that airplanes should use machine gun fire or bombs to scatter them. Dealing with unrest in Mesopotamia in 1921 as Secretary of State for Colonies, Churchill acted as a war criminal. I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against the uncivilized tribes. It would spread a lively terror. He ordered large-scale bombing of Mesopotamia with an entire village wiped out in 45 minutes. Shocking. In Afghanistan, Churchill declared that the Pashtuns needed to recognise the superiority of the British race and that all who resist will be killed without quarter. He wrote, "We proceeded systematically, village by village, and we destroyed the houses, filled up the wells, blew down the towers, cut down the great shade trees, burnt the crops and broke the reservoirs in punitive devastation. Every tribesman caught was speared or cut down at once." Savages. Savage. That's all they care about is sacrifice and murder. That's why we live in this, world, trying to wake people up to try and see that it's not us really that's doing it. We're just slaves and puppets to their manifestations of this world. In Kenya, Churchill either directed or was complicit in policies involving the forced relocation of local people from the fertile highlands to make way for white colonial settlers, and the forcing of more than 1,500 people into concentration camps. Rape, castration, lit cigarettes on tender spots, and electric shocks were all used by the British authorities to torture Kenyans under Churchill's rule. But the principal victims of Winston Churchill were the Indians, a beastly people with a beastly religion, as he charmingly called them. He wanted to use chemical weapons in India, but was shot down by his cabinet colleagues, whom he criticised for their squeamishness, declaring that the objections of the India office to use of gas against natives are unreasonable. Rightly so. but he did it anyway. Churchill's beatification as an apostle of freedom seems all the more preposterous given his 1941 declaration that the Atlantic Charter's principles would not apply to India and the coloured colonies. He refused to see people of colour as entitled to the same rights as himself. Gandhiism and all it stands for, he declared, will soon or later have to be grappled with and finally crushed. Which never happened. In such matters, Churchill was the most reactionary of Englishmen, with views so extreme that cannot be excused as being reflective of their times. Even his own Secretary of State for India, Leopold Emery, confessed that he could see very little difference between Churchill's attitude and Adolf Hitler's. Because there's the connection, you see. These people were put in place to do the job that they're supposed to do, which is mass murder and bring in the next part of the New World Order, which they're doing, ushering in through wars, chaos out of order. Thanks to Churchill, some 4 billion Bengalis starved to death in 1943 famine. Churchill ordered the diversion of food from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers, and even to top up European stockpiles in Greece and elsewhere. When reminded of the suffering of his Indian victims, his response was that the famine was their own fault, he said, for breeding like rabbits. Madhurshi Mukherjee's searing account of Churchill's role in the Bengal famine, Churchill's Secret War, documents that while Indians starved, prices for food grains were inflated by British purchases and India's own surplus grains were exported, while Australian ships laden with wheat were not allowed to unload their cargo at Calcutta, where the bodies of those who had died of starvation littered the streets. Instead, Churchill ordered that grain be shipped to storage depots in the Mediterranean and the Balkans to increase the buffer stocks for a possible future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. European warehouses filled up as Bengalis died. This week's Oscar Awards, yet another hagiography of this odious man. To the Iraqis whom Churchill advocated gassing, the Greek protesters on the streets of Athens, who were mowed down on Churchill's orders in 1944, sundry Pashtuns and Irish, as well as to Indians like myself, it will always be a mystery why a few bombastic speeches have been enough to wash the bloodstains of Church's racist hands. Rightly fucking so. Many of us will remember Churchill as a war criminal and an enemy of decency and humanity, a blinkered imperialist untroubled by the oppression of non-white peoples. Ultimately, his great failure, his long darkest hour, was his constant effort to deny us freedom. Not a great man, really, is he? No? No, and you're going to see much worse in him by the end of this. Winston Churchill, the racist war criminal. Again, we can read this: poisonous gas, about India, bombing of the Irish. Next, crimes of Britain. The trial of Winston Churchill. I'm not going to read this because it's very long. Fuck it, I will. England celebrates their genocides. The Winston Churchill note has entered circulation, honouring a man who swilled on champagne while 4 million men, women and children in Bengal starved due to his racist colonial policies. Churchill was a genocidal maniac. He is fawned over in Britain and held up as a hero of the nation. He was voted greatest Briton of all time. Below is the real history of Churchill, the history of white supremacists whose hatred for Indians led to 4 million starving to death. The man who loathed Irish people so much he conceived different ways to terrorise them. The racist thug who waged war on black people across Africa and Britain. This is the trial of Winston Churchill, the enemy of all humanity. And the reason why they say that is because all these people are the enemy of humanity. They all work together to bring in and usher in the New World Order. Afghanistan, Greece, India, Iran. Wow, he's a mass murderer, right? Iraq, Ireland, Kenya, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, British Ghana, China. Oh my word, this man is... Churchill extolled Mussolini. Right, let's go back to other mentions. Churchill ordered the overthrowing of the democratically elected leader of British Ghana. He dispatched troops and warships and suspended their constitution, all to put a stop to the government's nationalism plan. Now, nationalism, so people that live in their country and want to use their resources for their country, and that end up basically building a very blunt socialist society that benefits everyone. They don't want that. So countries like Venezuela, other countries that are actually trying to do better for themselves for using their resources and do not want globalist Zionism and capitalism in their country, well, they're the opposition now, because that is exactly, they're the countries that are, next in order to usher in a new world order. They're the ones that are standing in the way. They're the ones that are still trying to make it the world their way, instead of, as it should be, rather than how they're trying to make it be. I think we should have to take the Chinese in hand and regulate them. Churchill, his hope from this was for Aryan stock to triumph. Churchill donated funds for this Nazi war criminal's defence when he was on trial after World War II. Churchill suggested the motto, "Keep England White," when debating the adoption of new laws limiting immigration from the Caribbean. Churchill extolled Mussolini. "If I were Italian, I am sure I would have been with you entirely from the beginning. And what a man, Mussolini. I have lost my heart. Fascism has rendered a service to the entire world." This man's a lunatic. Psychopath. Born into Freemasonry. Churchill suggested 100,000 degenerate Britons should be forcibly sterilised, others put in labour camps to halt the decline of British race. He also went on to suggest that for tramps and wastrels there ought to be proper labour colonies where they could be sent. Churchill bragged that he personally shot at least 3 savages whilst there. Churchill plagiarised his famous "We shall fight on the beaches" from Emmett's speech from the dock. He urged the US to wipe out the Kremlin with an atomic bomb, hoping it would handle the balance of Russia. "I love this war. I know it's smashing and shattering the lives of thousands every moment." Churchill's cabinet general were obsessed about British people viewing black GIs favourably. Not only that, World War II, he wanted it to continue on for another 10 years.